So welcome guys. Today's guest is Greg Story. He's a veteran in the energy sector. He's currently CEO at My Greener Planet, which provides direct access to carbon credits in businesses, organizations and individuals to offset carbon emissions and achieve ESG targets via a self-funding structure. Greg is also a director at Hunter Lakes Corporation, which develops, owns, and manages environmental and water storage infrastructure, pumped hydro and energy storage. And finally, he's a partner at Sustainable Energy Partners, which is a developer, owner, and manager of large-scale clean energy infrastructure. Greg holds a master's in law and a bachelor in economics, and he also has a commercial pilot's license. That's some CV, Greg. Welcome.
Thanks, Jacob. How are you?
Yeah, very well, mate. Thanks for coming on today. I do appreciate your time. We'll get stuck straight in. Let's wind the clock back a little bit. Who's Greg Story, and what did your childhood and upbringing look like?
I had a very happy childhood. I grew up in the country, and so I have an affinity with the environment and the Australian bush, and I like visiting as often as I can the country, and in particular the area where I grew up in Western New South Wales, and still get a great amount of joy from making those visits.
So where are you located now?
In Sydney.
In Sydney. Okay. It's seems to be where a lot of the action is, so it makes sense. So I suppose when you were growing up as a kid, was it always like, did you have dreams of working in the energy industry, or was there something else that you wanted to be when you were growing up?
No, I didn't. I didn't aspire to any particular vocation when I was younger. I was always had an ambition to get a good education, but in terms of where that led me, I was never quite sure. And I fell into investment banking when I was at university through contacts, and was invited to do a Christmas role there in my second last year of university at an investment bank, and then joined that investment bank when I finished. And again, more by accident than design, ended up in infrastructure financing, and that led me into energy financing, which was all conventional energy, and in those days, gas, coal. I did some work on the Northwest Shelf, did some work on coal mines in the Hunter Valley, and the infrastructure associated with all of that on the financing, putting financing packages together for those projects.
I see. So it sounds like it sort of all happened organically rather than you sort of orchestrating that path in your career.
Yeah, that's correct. I never had a real mentor growing up or at university. It happened by mutual connections and being introduced, and having an affinity with those activities, and joining the investment bank, and getting stuck into it, and I enjoyed it.
And is that here in Australia, in Sydney, or where was that? Where did that kick
Yeah, I
off?
joined in Sydney, but I spent some time in London, and then more lately with renewable energy, I spent a lot of time in Europe, working in Spain and France and Italy and Germany and the UK in solar energy and wind, particularly solar. So I worked over there at the beginning of the renewable energy boom. It started in Germany with subsidies and grants and special tariffs for wind, and that grew across into solar. Germany was the leader in all of that, and they were followed a few years later by Spain, and then Italy, and then France, and then the UK. So it moved in a cycle around Europe, country by country. It didn't burst onto the scene right across Europe in one moment. It spread as governments introduced those subsidies and grants.
It's interesting you mentioned Europe, because obviously there's, I suppose, a bit of an energy crisis evolving over there at the moment. What's your sort of view on what's happening over there? And do you think that potentially some of those countries have gone too hard too early on the renewable side, and it's sort of coming back to bite them at the moment? What's your stance on that?
Well, I think their problems do stem back from 10 to 15 years ago, when the accepted doctrine was to provide grants and subsidies for renewables. The conventional thinking was that these are new technologies. They're not in the money as yet, and hence they need subsidies and grants. Consequently, Germany had extremely attractive, generous subsidies and grants. So too did Spain, Italy, France, and Germany in the early days. And some of those countries not only subsidised the generation, they also subsidised the consumption. So they subsidised consumers on their electricity price as well. So there was a double whammy, and that affected them all during the GFC, and it's still affecting them today, because those tariffs were those subsidies and grants were for very long terms, and they're still impacting the cost of energy today. So it led to a bonanza in renewable energy right across Europe, um, and and it would not have happened if it wasn't for those grants and subsidies, because they didn't stack up in their own right. Australia also followed suit in that regard. The state governments introduced very generous feed-in tariffs 10 years ago, as high as 60 cents a kilowatt hour. And looking back, they have caused a lot of damage, because the cost of those taxpayer-funded grants and subsidies is still working their way through the system. It means we had a bonanza in the generation side, but in Europe and in Australia, we didn't keep pace in changing the architecture of distribution and transmission. That stayed the same, and we are stuck with the perils of that still today in Australia. It's not as pronounced in Europe, because there's greater density population, but in Australia, where the population is spread out a lot more and the generation is co-located with coal mines, we are running into those problems today. So the architecture of transmission and generation doesn't suit where wind and solar is going to be located in Australia. And so my theory about all that is that we should not have been as generous. We should have waited and done it a lot more slowly, and waited for the cost of solar panels to come down, because they did decline incredibly dramatically. The cost of solar panels has dropped 95% since I've been working in the industry, which is just amazing. The cost of wind turbines hasn't fallen by anywhere near that much, but it has fallen significantly per megawatt or per megawatt hour of generation with the increased size of turbines. And it would have been a lot better for all countries if we had gone a bit slower. And it is a transition. We can't switch off coal and gas and move to renewables overnight, nor can we do that in 5 or 10 years. It's a 25-year transition, and we've got to be very careful that we don't destroy our baseload in the pursuit of these targets. We've got to do it in a well-managed fashion.
And do you think it's a case of just sort of waiting until the technology catches up to the cost of the energy being affordable and sustainable, or is it we have to push a bunch of subsidies into the system to really, suppose, get an uptick in adoption?
Well, the subsidies and grants that were offered in Europe and in Australia, but particularly in Australia, would have been better if it were applied to changing the architecture of transmission and distribution of energy around the country, so that that would have made it a lot cheaper and easier for solar farms and wind farms to be developed all over the country rather than being co-located with where the existing transmission and distribution lines were. That would have made it more efficient and cheaper. The China got into mass production of solar panels because they saw a huge economic opportunity globally. It wasn't foreseen how much the cost of solar panels would decline, but we still should have gone at it rather than like a bull at a gate, but more methodically and far better plans than it was.
Do you think it's the whole climate change and renewables has become too politicized, or like do you think the political parties are just using that as a tool to win votes, or is it that they actually want to see change? What's your
Yeah, it has become too politicised. I see the whole transition now as a technological advancement. It's divorced from climate change. Yes, climate change is there, but the debate has moved on. We should be addressing the advent of renewable energy as simply a technological change. We went from burning timber to coal and coke and having a very poisonous atmosphere, um, which led on to climate change. We now have far better technologies in the form of solar and wind and hydrogen and batteries. It's simply another industrial revolution, whether we're moving from water wheels to steam, from steam to coal. That's the change as I see it, and that's how it should be addressed. We should drop the debate and the argument about climate change and simply be moving into smarter technologies for energy generation, which clean up the atmosphere.
Yeah. And in terms of that technology side, what's sort of your prediction in terms of how far away we are to being able to transition to where the renewables are powering the baseload energy for a
We
country?
still need base load, whether it's coal or gas or nuclear or hydro, but we still need base load for another 10 to 20 years. We Because the commercial viability of battery storage just isn't there, and hydrogen just isn't there today. It may be, and hopefully will be in 10 years or so, but it's not there today. So we've got to be very careful about closing all the coal-fired power stations in Australia, simply because we have a lot of solar and wind energy as installed capacity, because it's got to meet demands 24/7, not just when the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, and it's got to meet demand all over the country, not just in certain areas. So it needs a far more capacity than you have in the totality of coal-fired power stations, um, and then we need some form of storage or firming of that energy, and that's coming and it's happening now, but it's not going to happen overnight.
So if we get the battery technology right, then we can store the energy from solar and wind, and when it's not windy and it's not sunny, then that can power for 24 hours. Is that pretty much what you're saying?
Yeah, well, battery storage comes in a number of different technologies. We have lithium and batteries, but also don't forget there's pumped hydro. Nuclear should not be off the table. Um, and so there's all the technologies should be in the mix for consideration, and there are lots of opportunities, particularly on the eastern seaboard, where pumped hydro is viable, and we should be advancing those, because having the battery storage, pumped hydro is a big battery, and having those pumped hydro projects up and down the eastern seaboard is cheaper and better than having it in one big location like Snowy 2.0. Snowy 2.0 is very expensive, and the energy needs to be transmitted from the Snowy to Melbourne and Sydney and further afield. Whereas, and that requires new transmission lines. Whereas if we had more smaller projects up and down the eastern seaboard along the Great Dividing Range, they can happen a lot more quickly. They are a lot more cost effective. They don't need new transmission lines or anywhere near as much as Snowy does, and so they could be a viable form of battery storage within a few years.
How does My Greener Planet, which you're currently CEO, how does that fit into the renewables industry in Australia, and where did that idea come from?
We have been involved in financing and developments and operations of solar farms and wind farms for a long time, and it's always an industry which is very much a closed shop. It's only open to pension funds, super funds, large institutional investors, and private equity. There is very little opportunity for smaller uh, investors, be it individual or corporate, to participate in that sector. In Australia, there are now no listed or quoted vehicles that can get you into renewable energy. There's still some overseas, but we wanted to democratise the industry and enable individuals and companies, large and small, to participate as owners in solar farms and wind farms. There's a limited number of people who can put solar on their rooftops, and there's a lot of people who live in apartment buildings and don't have suitable rooftops or can't afford it. So giving them the opportunity to acquire small fractional interests in large solar farms, which are far more efficient than solar panels on rooftops, seemed to be a great opportunity for us to explore. And we started on that journey 7 years ago. It's taken a long time to perfect the model, and it took a long time to get the legal structure right so that individuals and companies have direct ownership of the asset itself. So they in effect own the energy which is being generated, and also they own the carbon credits which are being produced. So for a company who wants to offset its residual carbon footprint, it can acquire an interest directly in the solar farm which is producing the carbon credits, and so it has a stream or a pipeline of carbon credits available to it over the course of the life of the solar farm or the wind farm, which is 35 or 45 years. So we're disrupting the existing carbon markets and making it accessible and financially viable for individuals and companies and organisations, schools, clubs, societies can all participate in the industry. There's a lot of taxpayers' money which is still going in to support renewables, as we talked about a few minutes ago. And we always thought, well, why should those subsidies and grants only be going to favour large institutional investors? Why can't everybody participate in the sector?
Yeah, well, it really attracted myself and Pickup when I spoke with you initially. Obviously, the type of business that we are, we're fully remote, and we've got subcontractors and vehicles sort of all over the place. So we don't have a big footprint in terms of we can put up our own solar panels and all that sort of stuff. So, and we were looking to offset some of the emissions from the vehicles that we had. So it really suits the type of business that we are. Electric vehicles probably aren't at the point yet for subcontractors to be able to go and afford one. They probably don't make economical sense for them just yet. So this type of opportunity for us just really made sense, and it's something that we're really happy to continue with for the foreseeable future. So for someone who's been involved, yeah, it's really good, and looking forward to see what else you guys come up with in the near future. And just on that, what's sort of like the next 3 to 5 years look like for My Greener Planet? What's sort of the big plan? Is there anything like North Star that you guys have?
Yeah, My Greener Planet has been very successful because we're enabling companies like yours who want to offset their carbon footprint to, in effect, produce their own carbon credits rather than buying carbon credits from somebody else. And when you buy carbon credits on the carbon markets, it's pretty opaque. There's a distinct lack of transparency. You're never quite sure where the carbon credits are being produced. You're not sure of their efficacy. But owning the asset which is producing the carbon credits deals with all those issues that companies have. The solar farms and the wind farms must be accredited by the federal government, and the carbon credits are issued by the federal government. So there's no issues about greenwashing. And then, as well as that, you're receiving your share of the revenues from the solar farm and the wind farm, so it repays the cost. So you end up with carbon credits which don't cost anything. So in the future, we want to expand array of projects or assets from solar farms and wind farms into other projects which are producing carbon credits plus a revenue. There's soil carbon, there's some environmental projects in Australia and overseas which are producing both revenue and carbon credits. And the idea is to expand the array of assets which are available for companies and individuals to acquire shared ownership. And so our only requirement is to make sure that they are truly helping to reduce carbon emissions and genuinely addressing climate change and produce both carbon credits and the revenue. The ability to have that revenue stream to repay the cost is important to us. Individuals find it very engaging that they are directly involved in the ownership of an asset which is producing green energy and carbon credits. And companies like that as well. It gives everybody a seat at the table in this joint endeavour of reducing emissions and helping save the planet.
So, what's something in the renewables industry that's sort of like commonly held belief that you disagree with, that maybe not so many other people disagree with?
I think that commonly held belief is what we were talking about earlier, Jacob, and that is that renewables need subsidies and grants to be viable and to get them off the ground. And I don't believe that at all. They do need support to make that transition from coal and gas. Otherwise, we would stay fat, dumb, and happy where we were. So it does need encouragement, but that encouragement can come in the form of setting the right environment out there. And that means changing the way we transmit and distribute energy around the country. It's what's known as a spoken wheel design at the moment, where we have very large centres of generation of coal at, for instance, the Hunter Valley and the Latrobe Valley, and then the transmission lines emanate out from those two centres like spokes on a wheel. Whereas the solar and wind needs to be distributed all over the country, and that reduces the transmission losses that occur when energy is generated over large distances. You can lose 10 or 15% of the energy in the form of heat. Whereas if you're a lot closer to where it's being used, a lot closer to the load centre, those transmission losses are reduced significantly. So it doesn't require money being thrown at it. It requires an awareness that we need to move in this direction. But The impetus can come by governments setting the right scene and creating the right um, infrastructure environment to encourage the development of wind and solar.
And are you guys purely focused at My Greener Planet? Are you guys purely focused on solar, or is there other sources that you guys are potentially looking at in the future?
Now, we have wind farms that will be going on the platform as well. So users can select a wind farm or a solar farm, which they want to, which is in their vicinity. We have open days at the projects where a company can take out their staff, their customers, their suppliers. We have education days and staff picnic days. So it's all about creating that nexus between individuals and companies and the wind farm and the solar farm. People want to know that they are directly involved in helping save the planet. They're not satisfied to sit back and let governments do it. There's a certain amount of distrust in that, not just in Australia, but all around the world. People, young and old, want to be involved in this transition from coal to renewables. And so giving them a seat at the table by direct ownership of the generating asset is an important objective that My Greener Planet does fulfill.
And I think I might know the answer to this one, but do you believe it's up to the government or private enterprise such as you guys at My Greener Planet to really be the driving force in making renewables affordable and reliable energy source?
Well, it's got to be a marriage. It's got to be a combination of both. The private sector will make it happen, but the scene and the environment has to be set by the government and by the existing utilities, who will only do it with government coercion or direction. But it's got to be a marriage of both, Jacob, between government and the private sector. But there's plenty of support for involvement in the industry, as My Greener Planet has proved. We've had great success with individuals and companies who do want to be involved in the production of renewable energy. There's no shortage of interest, and governments have got to set the scene, and the private sector will follow.
And do you think the government is doing enough in Australia at the moment to push us forward in that direction, or is there is there something else or other things that they could be doing now to really help progress?
No, I think there is more that they can do. Governments are still myopic about the belief that renewables need financial support, and wind and solar do not need financial support. If there is going to be any financial support, it should be in the form directed at the storage of the equation. Solar, and as everybody keeps saying, solar energy is the cheapest form of energy generation. It is, providing the sun's shining. But we do need support in energy storage, and I would prefer to see the government, on behalf of taxpayers, for instance, develop a network of battery storage stations around Australia. 100 years ago or more, the government at the time knew that we needed electricity distribution and transmission. And so all the generators and all the transmitters and distributors 100 years ago were owned by state governments. The federal government realised that we needed a national telecommunications network, so they set up the predecessors of Telstra to build that. And that was done with water distribution and other essential services. Many of those have since been privatised because they've become financially viable. So too will battery charging stations become viable, but right now they're not. And rather than throwing money at it in the form of grants and subsidies, I'd prefer the government build the network and also become involved in other forms of storage. In 10 or 20 or 50 years' time, they can be sold off as other utilities have been over the last 10 years or so. But the taxpayers will reap the rewards rather than giving those grants and subsidies to a very few people or organisations. Allow the taxpayer to become involved.
As long as they roll it out better than what they've done with the broadband network, because Australia still has some of the worst internet in the world.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the NBN's been a total disaster from start to finish. It wasn't driven, the NBN was not driven by commercial reality. They started rolling out the fibre in country towns, and not only country towns, but at the back end of a country town. So rather than rolling it out, starting the rollout down Pitt Street and George Street and Queen Street and Burke Street, they started where the usage was going to be the lowest. So I completely agree that there needs to be some commercial reality in how you roll out any government enterprise, for that matter, and not just look at it as providing a service to everybody. It's got to be done in a commercially viable manner.
Yeah, totally agree. How do you guys approach marketing your business, My Greener Planet? How do you get the word out to the public about the services that you offer and the benefits?
It's really been done by word of mouth, Jacob, because it has been so successful with individuals and companies. They've all talked about it, and that's where the new customers have come from. However, we are looking at a marketing program at the moment involving social media and digital advertising. We have been operating fairly low key. We haven't had to do any promotion because it's been so successful by people passing it on to friends and colleagues. But we are looking at overseas expansion, and that will require a marketing strategy which will be built around social media and digital advertising.
Any inklings of where you guys are looking, or is that still under wraps?
No, we're looking at Singapore and the UK to start with, and then North America and Western Europe, Belgium, Netherlands, the Nordics, and Spain.
And is there anything else out in the market at the moment that's similar to what you guys are offering, or is this? I mean, I haven't seen anything in Australia, but what about overseas?
No, we constantly review what's happening, not just in Australia, but globally, and there is no other platform which is providing direct ownership of the asset. There are lots and lots of new platforms which are offering carbon credits. Sometimes they're from projects that particular company owns, or they're acting as brokers or middlemen. There are also lots of projects, lots of websites and platforms which are offering carbon credits from charitable projects such as environmental projects, which don't produce any income. But there are no platforms around which give people direct ownership of the asset itself. So we are unique globally in that regard. So you get the revenue, you own the asset, you own the energy which it's produced, you therefore own the revenues from the sale of that energy, and you own the carbon credits which are produced. And that's truly unique, and that's quite amazing that it is. But the owners of those assets don't want to sell the assets. They want to sell the energy and sell the carbon credits and make as much profit for themselves rather than share the ownership with others, which is what we're doing.
Well, it sounds like there's an opportunity there for you guys to really carve out your own little category within the renewable sector, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's proved very successful with individuals who want to participate in helping save the planet and not just leave it to other people and governments. We've had schools involved and clubs and organisations who want to go carbon neutral, and lots of companies who want a carbon neutral product. So it's in high demand of being able to fulfil those goals of directly participating in the industry and fulfilling your objectives to become carbon neutral and offer carbon neutral products and services.
Yeah, well, it's obviously an industry on the rise, so there's definitely a lot of upside there for you guys for sure. Is there anything that you guys are facing at the moment in terms of a big challenge or stonewall or anything like that? And how are you guys tackling it? Or maybe
No,
something that's happened in the past when you
it's
first
just the
started with it?
logistics. No, our challenge, Jacob, is going to be the logistics of going offshore. There are always solar farms and wind farms to buy. Um, some of those are quite large, so we are looking at partnering with larger investment funds that either own those assets or can help us buy them while we sell them down, because the projects that we offer on the platform are completed and operating. This is not a cash box to build new projects. They are put on the platform at the price we buy them at from independent owners and developers. We're not developing these ourselves and making a profit on the way through. We're buying them at the best possible price when they're completed and operating, and they go on the platform. So as we require larger and larger projects to meet demand, we will need some funding support or a partner to do that, and we will need some funding support to go overseas, because when we do go offshore, we want to do it quickly, not a slow burn. It's got to be done very quickly, and to do that successfully, we'll need a funding partner.
How are you guys managing through the recent downturn? Obviously, funding and capital sort of dried up a little bit the last 12 months, I'd say, but are you guys finding it a little bit more difficult?
We're okay so far because the projects have been sold down very quickly. We don't own them for very long, but the debt costs have gone up quite a bit for project finance, but they are being sold down very quickly. There is an increase in the costs involved, so we are able to team with a fund or a big brother who owns projects or can warehouse those projects for us. That could be financially attractive for us.
What is one piece of advice you'd give to a young person starting out in the renewables industry in Australia?
Don't be impatient. Don't think that it's all going to happen tomorrow. My Greener Planet, we started developing My Greener Planet, the concept of it 6 years ago, and we did a lot of test marketing and talking to people about the product. We changed the structure of it and the features of it many times over the years, and refined it, and went back again and spoke to a lot of people and workshopped it to get it right. Yes, there are apps and technology out there which has gone off very quickly with a bang, and ours, once we launched it, has gone very well. But we were very careful and methodical to get to the launch date before we did go public with it, to make sure that we had done a lot of test marketing and roadshows and workshops with individuals and companies to get the structure absolutely right and offer the features and the applications which was going to suit everybody.
So, just changing flavors for a bit, we'll wrap up. We've got a few more questions. One thing that I always like to ask people is what's one book you would recommend for people to read and why? Are you a reader?
Yes, I don't read books as much as I'd like to because of the time constraints, but I'm reading a book at the moment about the life of a person who I have met, of ships and shoes and Scotland, and it's the life of this guy who now lives in Australia, but was born and grew up in Scotland, and worked in the shipping industry, and travelled the world and worked his way up in the shipping industry from a deckhand to a very senior management role and the CEO of a reasonably large shipping company. And I found that book very interesting because it's a true story, it's a life story, and it talks about his trials and challenges and along the way, and how he succeeded. And you think about, when you're reading those sort of books, you think about your own life and what you've done and what you haven't done and what you could have done better. So I find that jolts a lot of thinking along the way.
Yeah, ship life would be an interesting one, just being out for some of those guys are months on end, right? It would get a bit lonely out there, I would imagine.
Yeah, it would. And luckily he spent most of his life on the top deck as an officer and in the corporate world in shipping companies. But yeah, being a deckhand in shipping today would be a pretty tough life and lowly paid.
Yeah, definitely a special kind of person to be able to cop that for months on end for sure. I'm not sure if I could do it. Is there anyone who's been a really big influence on you throughout your career? Or I know you mentioned earlier you didn't really have any mentors growing up, but has there been anyone in the last 20 years or something like that you've really looked up to, or has helped guide you through your career?
No, I can't say there is. I know that a lot of successful people say, yeah, they were lucky enough to have a great mentor to guide and steer them. And I didn't, so I found my own way, made mistakes, learnt from those mistakes, and moved on. And I'm not sure whether there's anybody out there who can tell you how to do it, tell you what to do, and tell you how to do it. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to learn from those mistakes. And yes, you can learn from other people's mistakes, but I talk to other people and learn from other people and read widely about other people's stories and journeys and pick up on all sorts of things that have happened in other people's lives, rather than having one particular mentor. Looking back, I've got a whole cast of mentors. Not that they know it, but it's just from reading about other people and reading the history of companies and entrepreneurs and individuals. They've all got a different style. They've all done it differently, and I don't think there's any one person out there who can just tell you how to do it all. It's a matter of learning and picking up from lots of different people rather than one or two particular people.
You just touched on before that you've made a few mistakes along the way. Is there anything that stands out in your mind, and what would be like the learning that you've taken from that mistake or failure potentially?
We initially thought that My Greener Planet had one particular application, and that was to enable individuals and companies to acquire fractional or shared ownership of a solar farm or a wind farm and earn a share of the revenues and the profits and earn a share of the carbon credits that are produced. That was our original thinking, and that's what we saw as being the product, and that was the extent of the product. However, when we started talking to companies and workshopping this with companies, we realised that there was a lot of different applications of My Greener Planet. For instance, in talking to a couple of banks, they're looking at using My Greener Planet to create a green home loan. So they will lend $400,000 to a borrower to buy a home, and then they will lend an additional amount of $5,000 or $10,000, which the borrower applies towards My Greener Planet and will earn a share of the carbon credits, which will offset the carbon footprint or the emissions of the home. So everybody can now have a green home loan. It doesn't require the home to meet the neighbours' ratings, which is very strict. Everybody can acquire an interest in My Greener Planet, get the carbon credits, and end up with a carbon neutral home. The airlines are looking at My Greener Planet to utilise, to either replace or add to their existing fly carbon neutral options. So the passenger will, instead of putting some money into a charitable project somewhere which is earning carbon credits, they can acquire a small part of a solar farm which will give them carbon credits and make that journey carbon neutral. Next time they fly, they can add to that shareholding they have in the solar farm. And it can be used as a loyalty program. There's two retailers looking at it to enable their customers, the shoppers, instead of acquiring points in a loyalty scheme, you acquire points in a solar farm, and the company will get the carbon credits to offset their carbon footprint, and the shopper will get the points, which gives them ownership of the solar farm and the dividends from the solar farm. So we didn't see all that at the outset. We quickly jumped onto it when these suggestions and ideas came forward, but we didn't quite realise the extent to which My Greener Planet could be applied.
Yeah, it sounds like there's going to be probably a bunch more applications that will come out of the woodwork as you guys progress on your journey. But yeah, some really interesting concepts there, and yeah, look forward to seeing new ones pop up in the future. We might wrap up there, Greg, but before we close, where can people find you or My Greener Planet online if they want to touch base and learn more about the services that you offer?
Yeah, very happy to talk to people. We're accessible through the website mygreenerplanet.com, and there's a link there to get in touch with us as well. There's a lot of individuals and companies who sign up straight off the website, but there's also a lot that want to talk to us and get more information and learn more about it and learn how they can apply it. And we're more than happy to do that. So we're always accessible through the website is probably the best way, Jacob.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Greg, and thank you for helping us level up.
Thanks, Jacob. Very happy to talk.